Welcome to Outbound Call Center Responses to COVID-19. Today we'll be looking at how call centers across the US are shifting their business operations and strategies in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The last few months have seen a dramatic paradigm shift in both consumer behavior and contact center operations, given new legislation and shelter-in-place policies across the nation. These changes have added numerous challenges to an often already stressed system, and many call centers are seeking industry best practices on how to operate with optimal efficiency and effectiveness in this new reality. Joining us today are two people who've been at the front lines of this change. Art Scholler, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester, focusing on contact center applications and delivery, and Adam Russell, Vice President of Customer Intelligence and Risk Solutions at Neustar. We are honored to have them both with us today. Art, let's start with you. What are you observing and hearing from outbound contact centers as they respond to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic?
It's a great way to start out here. It's really I find myself using, unfortunately, the word unprecedented so many times that I start looking for synonyms or other ways to express it. The outbound side of the equation here is one where, first of all, it's let's get everybody home. And so that early storming phase, that where there's so much movement in so little time, it's really created a crisis management atmosphere within the entire operational chain of command, but within the organization as well. Along with the pandemic, has created a situation where a number of industries have been impacted severely, either by a business downturn or sometimes at the same time a traffic upturn, which is not the greatest thing. But for outbound, we look at operations that typically are organizations that are doing collections or doing outbound selling. Those are two typical buckets. How are those impacted? Are people willing to buy right now? When you're trying to collect, are people out of work and we have extended discussions about payment plans? That's kind of some of the things that are impacting outbound organizations. Plus, what happens here is that where people sit in the seat to do this work has some significant changes. Many US organizations, for example, either run their own contact centers or have outsourced these operations for doing calling to other geographies that perhaps may be more severely impacted and don't have the infrastructure to allow agents to work from home. Not necessarily to pick on particular geographies, but India, the Philippines are two locations that are quite popular because of labor costs and also language availability. But to a certain extent, the infrastructure in those countries is not the greatest. So these are some of the things that come to mind when we think about the outbound call center operations. There's a few more, but let me just pause there and see if there's some questions with what I've said so far.
Thanks, Art. I completely agree with you, and a lot of what you said is very consistent with the conversations that I'm having with my clients as they're struggling with a number of these issues. So one quick thing I thought we could do is maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of the impacts that you just mentioned and how companies are working to address them.
Yeah, it's, from what companies have to do to address some of these challenges is, well, wait a minute, if we have to move everybody home, we have to do that. Once we move people home, do we have enough people? Because we're in an industry where our need to reach out with outbound calling, as I mentioned in collections, done the right way, it's a contact and it's a negotiation. And because people are out of work, there's probably a little more subtle handholding that has to go along with that call. And we might not have everybody available at home because they couldn't get there or work the same kind of hours that we had in the past. We might have to bring on some additional staff. So there's some training that has to go along with this as well to be able to get people up to speed, being able to handle that empathetic type of negotiation type call. And we still have to, in the outbound arena, comply. There's lots of regulations that surround outbound calling. The do not call lists, the telemarketing sales rule are all things that are really critical because the fines are not going away. just because of the pandemic. I haven't seen anyone talking about let's relax the TCPA, let's relax do not call lists because we're in the midst of a pandemic. So these are a number of things that crop up, which in the environment today, with outbound calling being sort of, let's say, impaired by the amount of robocalling that's going on, and people just have doubts and may not pick up the phone. In fact, robocalling, well, guess what? The robocallers, the scammers are very opportunistic and they move very quickly. They're doing COVID-19 scams in all sorts of different shapes and forms. So there's even more reasons for consumers to be reluctant to pick up the phone because here's another scam. Why should I ever pick up the phone?
You know, you bring up an interesting point about how opportunistic scammers can be. They certainly love to prey on chaos and catastrophes and things along those lines. And I think all of the items you just mentioned, all of the trends have really come to a head here during the pandemic. And all of them are negatively impacting the efforts around outbound dialing, whether it's the staffing levels themselves, people adjusting to working from home, certainly no relief from the regulations, and then all of us as consumers being really trained not to answer the phone anymore because of robocalling, because of scams and the like, which makes all of the legitimate dialing that much more difficult. One thing I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into was this geographic phenomenon that we have, where you mentioned the Philippines and India. They've essentially shut down, and that's true both from an outbound dialing as well as an inbound servicing perspective. A number of my clients are really struggling with the amount of capacity that is taken away from them, and they're looking to onshore or outsource it differently, those heads, so that they can meet the capacity needs that they have. What sort of actions do you see clients taking to address that? Both the double whammy of outsourced capacity is now going away because countries are shut down, but then also this phenomenon of working from home and the challenges that presents.
I mean, let's address the shoring problem first, and that is, either the outsourcers who have operations in those countries, or as I mentioned earlier, organizations that have their own captives, call centers in those locations. We so for everybody, their business continuity plans basically have been ripped bare. We do business continuity. It's basically an insurance policy. And for this amount of risk, I pay this kind of premium. For this amount of risk, I pay this kind of premium. So it's all of us doing the math as far as how we're going to cover a certain level of calculated risk. This pandemic blew the doors off of pretty much everybody's risk assessment and calculations. So it's been a scramble for everybody. So relevant to your question, if I have a lot of my traffic where I'm doing a lot of my dialing out of some of these geographies where there are infrastructure and many other impairments, do I bring it back onshore? Well, guess what? Onshore in this conversation, if we're talking specifically the United States, we're shut down as well. Now, it's like, well, or maybe there are other geographic locations where, now this would be more typically with the support of an outsourcer who already has staffing and capacity in multiple geographies. Maybe they can shift it to another geography where they're much more capable of having agents go home. The infrastructure is there, the training is there. So it's not a matter of bringing necessarily onshore. It could be bringing it to the right shore. But this, again, from a business continuity perspective, is everyone scrambling to do that now. It will cause a number of companies, as they look at these arrangements for their own captive centers or working with an outsourcer, to ask more of these questions in the future.
I think that's exactly right. And it'll be interesting to see what sort of long-term impacts this has. right? Does it completely change the way that this planning goes? Does it completely change the outsource versus insource, or which shore they go to longer term? I don't know that. I don't think all the final chapters are written here, but it'll certainly be an interesting story to see unfold for sure.
I agree. I agree. And again, this is how much am I willing to pay in terms of an insurance premium to cover my risk? Do I now want an arrangement where my traffic is split between a couple of locations instead of being highly concentrated in locations where there is severe business continuity risk because of another potential pandemic? It's not like this is an earthquake. I mean, I hate to be talking about these things. These all impact people, but an earthquake or a tsunami is something that's concentrated. This is something that's everywhere. So it means that having more options and more places to generate outbound traffic from is something that people will be looking for now, as opposed to, well, if that location, then we can shift to one other location. No, we want to be able to shift to four other locations.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's funny, the point you just made is a good setup to the next question I was going to ask you. The fact that this is impacting on a global basis is truly unprecedented. I'll use the word again, but it also seems to be hitting all industries to some degree, some certainly more than others. I mean, we've seen plenty of media articles and seen firsthand the impact it's had in the travel and hospitality industry, the financial services industry, manufacturing, and others. I'm curious from your perspective how the different industries have been uniquely affected by the challenges that this pandemic has created, and where you see the impacts being much more severe.
Yeah, I know we've talked already, since we're focusing on outbound call centers, more generically collections, which spans many industries. But let's dive into some of those specific industry observations. Um, I don't think there's a surprise for anyone here that the travel and transportation industry has really gotten hammered with a downturn in traffic and therefore revenue, and that extends to the hotel industry as well. So anything going on in terms of both outbound and inbound for those industries are way down, and the traffic is way down as well. Now, initially, the airlines and hotels and so on had a lot of cancellation and rebookings. Well, this resulted not just in inbound calls, but because the companies weren't fully prepared with their policy, there was well, we'll have to get back to you. And whether or not that's an email or whether or not that's a phone call, it was kind of in the early stages. There were, return phone calls that needed to be placed because, well, canceling that airline ticket and giving you a full credit as opposed to we can rebook you on another flight. I mean, there's a lot of change going on early in the process in those industries. Another one where there is a lot of negotiation and a back and forth is, pretty much any place where there's payments. So this is in advance of collections. It's I'm out of my job and I need to get in touch with my mortgage company, and I'm sitting in queue for what sounds like 2 hours because everyone's trying to renegotiate their mortgage or their car loan because we're out of work and there's a business downturn. The interesting thing that happens here, which to a certain extent, one way to have those organizations work is to offer callback, which in and of itself is a whole science in terms of best practices for callback, meeting the promise of when you said you'd call back, would you call back at a certain point in time or whatever. But it's a quick, usually for most companies, it's a pretty quick thing to implement to be able to smooth out some of those peaks in traffic. Another category that always has been a special one here in the United States within the telemarketing sales rule, the TSR, is political campaigns. So we're entering into a pretty heavy political season here, a presidential race starting to ramp up. And no, we have kind of lost some of the primaries because of COVID-19, but there's always been special permission for political campaigns to make outbound calls to do fundraising. Well, guess what? We're at home, but hey, where are those people? Where are they located? Can they make those calls? It's the work at home question all over again. And will people pick up the phone in the midst of all of this? So those are a few samples where from a outbound calling perspective, and perhaps maybe some of this can be shifted to, you know, proactive texting as well, but that in and of itself has all that realm of, do people give you permission to text them and give them information that they might need in a proactive fashion? Last one, just, on the government side of things, I mentioned earlier that, state and local government is just seeing a huge influx of traffic. Largely, we're out of work, and so the unemployment lines are clogged because the website crashed. But again, going back to that, we can't resolve it during the first call, then we need to call you back and get back to you. When does that happen with a call center that's completely overloaded with traffic? So it's very interesting to see that industry by industry, and it's not just getting the call center workforce home, it's seeing the individual dynamics in a number of these industries.
Absolutely. I know that I've certainly seen an uptick in the amount of calls that we receive either at my house or on my cell phone. I think everybody's realizing that that's where we are now, and that all the consumers and all of the people that they would typically try to reach, whether it's for business purposes or emergency notifications, political outreach, et cetera, has shifted. And it's interesting with that increase of calls, if the phone just ringing that much more. I've also noticed an increase in the amount of spam tagging that I'm seeing appear on my phones, again, either my landline or even my wireless phones. Certainly, we know that with volume comes increased tagging and even call blocking at this point, which would certainly be a challenge for legitimate organizations that are erroneously being caught up in those nets. So that's another challenge I think that's going on out there. And you brought up the point about the give and take between outbound and inbound, whether it's from a callback perspective or even just calling to the company's call centers. I was in conversations over the past week with two of my larger financial services clients who have found that people, oftentimes not even their customers, are calling them, and they're calling them because they've received phone calls from a given phone number that alleges to be that bank or that financial services company. And what we found through partnering with them and doing some research is that fraudsters are actually spoofing their phone numbers and doing sometimes 5 to 10 times the amount of dialing to either steal identities or to phish or to initiate some form of fraud against unknowing consumers. And what better way to do it than to have it appear that it's their banking institution and so forth. So interesting that they first found out about it from their inbound call center as the customers or the prospects were calling back saying, hey, why did you call me? I'm not even a customer. And we were able to work with them to identify where some of the problems are and help to address some of that. So again, going back to that idea of fraud, really blossoming during chaos, that's a perfect example of what's happening and of the interplay between outbound and inbound.
Absolutely. And this is the whole thing, that the spammers and scammers are just incredibly flexible and very adept today. And the other thing that, of course, allows them to do that is the technology. So that, the ability to call from any place around the globe, the lower cost voice over IP type of connections that can be made to facilitate that, the technology to be able to launch calls, to make calls, and to be able to spoof caller ID. This is stuff that's just so easily available today, is one of the large reasons why we see such a huge influx of all these different mechanisms and the one that you just described, use an existing branded bank, phone number to make the call and make it look like it's coming from XYZ Bank. That's a well-known name, and then we're off to the races. And they don't need to get a huge percentage to make their money. All they need is very, very low percentages of connects and contacts and successful scams. They're working a big numbers game with very low cost technology and ease of deployment.
That's exactly right. And the speed with which this hits and expands is striking. I mentioned the two clients that I'm working with. We saw the spike in volumes the very same day. So when they hit one bank, they were hitting another bank, and we're working with our other clients to see just how deep the hole goes. So you're exactly right. The technology, the cost, and the opportunity all are setting the table for the fraudsters to really, unfortunately, take advantage of people during this difficult time. Mm-hmm. So amidst all of this, what can companies do to really help to proactively support their customers?
So I think that in the realm of outbound call centers, we go back to the concept of trust. And how do I establish the validity of who I am, that the consumers who are being contacted can literally trust that this is a good call, this is a good entity on the other end of the line? How is that all done? And to ensure also that your people are well trained in the call centers that are making the call. I go back to the regulations. Yep, making sure that there is compliance, not only for the technology that's launching the outbound calls is in line with the do not call lists and all the TCPA regulations, but the people themselves are trained to be able to comply with the right opening statement, as is required, for example, on collections calls to begin the call. So there's training, there's the right technology, and being able to monitor their activity either with automated systems that check to see if they're in compliance, or being able to sample enough calls, record them, and have your QA teams continually guiding and coaching the agents to, adhere to the right policies and procedures. And look, we could say regulations are, the regulations are there because in the long run, there was an impact on consumers, and consumers want a trusted relationship. So the regulations are actually reflecting the need for trust.
I've often said that as I talk with my clients about compliance and why the regulations are in place. And even though the current iterations of them may not always make the most sense or may not seem the most business friendly, they always started from the right need. And it usually starts with the consumer to make sure that they are protected, that their privacy is intact, that they're not being harassed or taken advantage of in some way. And so I think that that's true now more than ever, that companies need to ensure that they remain compliant, and I'm happy to say that in my conversations with my clients, similar to what you said earlier in the conversation, none of them have relaxed any of their focus around compliance. In fact, quite the opposite. What I see is companies doing everything they can to be customer focused and to be compliant with the regulations that are out there. So I think that's a good news trend, though it does always become a bit of a complication, further complication in the outbound dialing efforts that they're making. Yep. So, it definitely sounds that, proactive outreach, support, providing the messaging to customers while being compliant, all very important steps that companies should be taking to take care of their customers. At the end of the day, what are some of the primary impacts that you're seeing from operations and compliance angles within the call centers?
So, we mentioned earlier, hey, we got to go home, and then we need to get staffing. So, okay, it's the scramble to get staffing. If we need to get staffing that are not already trained, then we have to train them. And in that realm, in terms of folks that need to be trained, then we need to kind of turn up our quality assurance efforts. And this is kind of like a double whammy, because many times people who fulfill that quality assurance type role, both on the inbound and the outbound side, are folks who are also capable or rose up through the ranks, and they may be ones that are being told to get back on the phones. So there's a staffing and a constraint problem there as well. So I think that the operations and compliance issues certainly haven't gone away. I think perhaps there's a little bit of relaxation on some of that, but the idea that we need to do this with a constantly learning model day by day and adjusting and flexing and being able to do that very quickly with management providing the insight and the leadership and direction to say the traffic today, what we're going to do today, what staff we have available today, what can we do today, is pretty amazing. And when I see organizations that can flex that quickly, I'm hoping that they keep that agility as we get out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you did just mention a little bit about compliance in general and potential areas of relaxation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So, I actually said earlier that, we're not relaxing the regulations, and in fact, we have. So I kind of want to take that back a little bit. The recognition by the FCC that we, in essence, have the essential workers who need to communicate and communicate with, call it patients or whatever. I mean, just imagine what we're going to be doing as we come out of this and we start to scale contact tracing. We're going to need to make calls. We're going to need to contact people. Yes, I certainly can appreciate that Apple, Google, and there's a lot of work being done with mobile applications to do this. But I think it's going to come down to having quite a lot of people. The state of New York is talking about some phenomenal numbers and putting that in place. They're going to need the ability to call a stranger who has not opted in, but it is someone who is listed on a contact list of someone who has the COVID-19 virus. So, there's some relaxation here that in the healthcare realm, whether it's a private healthcare institution, private hospital, or state and local, or someone else within a government entity that needs the ability to make those contacts, is pretty important. Now, the content of these calls is that we're just communicating information, or like I said here, for contact tracing, it has to be tied to this to kind of get the relaxation of the regulation. But I find it very interesting that we have a government response here that is pretty quick in response to the pandemic to kind of free up this very select category of contacting people and outbound calling.
I'm equally surprised at how quickly this moved, and I think it's a really important opening for very specific types of messages and purposes. So I think this is a great example of government at work, and really trying to make sure that consumers are protected, that they're getting what they need, and that the companies that need to support the consumers have the flexibility that they need. But I think you've brought up some very important points around here, around just how specific this exemption is, to whom it applies, and under what circumstances. So certainly very narrowly defined, and I think appropriately so. Mm-hmm. It's become very clear that so many different things have changed, and really, if you look back, it's only been 6, 7, 8 weeks that we've all been living through the COVID-19 impacts. But really, the outbound dialing world has been slowly evolving for many years now, with whether it's regulations or technology or restrictions and other things. Certainly reactions to robo-dialing and everything else has been a big topic over the past year, along with the associated spam tagging and the like, all of which has really made the outbound dialing industry really difficult. And more than anything, what I think this really underscores is that every single dial matters. Every single dial matters. And with changes to staffing and contact information, the efficiency challenges we're seeing today, spam tagging and so forth, all of this is becoming very, very important. So what I'd like to do is spend just a few minutes talking through how Neustar helps to support our clients in addressing some of these challenges. At its core, outbound dialing is not a simple equation, but it has a few different considerations that everybody really needs to consider, starting with whom to contact. Secondly, which number to use across their cell phone numbers, their home numbers, recent numbers, old numbers, etc. When is the best time to contact them, and time of day, day of week, etc. And then ensuring that everything is operating properly within the telco infrastructure, because you could have the best contact information. You could be trying to call the customer at the best time of day. You could have it all right, but then your phone number is being spam tagged or blocked altogether. So these are the areas where Neustar primarily plays to ensure that our customers have the most accurate customer information, the most robust and unique intelligence around phone numbers and dialing optimization, and then providing the necessary solutions to be able to ensure that the calls are actually going all the way through. How does Neustar do this? How are we positioned to be able to do this? Well, the reality is for over 20 years, Neustar has been playing critical roles in the telecommunications infrastructure, just ensuring that it's powered correctly and operating efficiently and effectively. And through that, we've created unique partnerships with the carriers and a variety of other industry players. And it's enabled us to really deliver unique insights and assistance to our customers. Many people don't know that Neustar actually powers over 90% of caller ID in North America today. So billions of times a day, every single day, as phone calls are connected, Neustar is queried to provide the name and phone number to display on a caller ID box or on a telephone or on a handset or on a TV every single day. And that's just one example of how Neustar powers some of the telecommunications infrastructure. And because we have that ability, we also have the ability to register phone numbers and to ensure that spam tags are removed where appropriate and that calls are going through and being connected effectively. But really the equation for appropriate outbound dialing and effective outbound dialing takes a few different components. The first one is the correct data. So our repository is fed by over 250 different data sources and ensures that we can score and append information to our consumers so that if their data is outdated or incorrect or just in some way suboptimal, we can ensure that they're operating with the best contact information possible. Knowing the insights around the best time of day to call a consumer or best day of week or just the right phone number to use, especially now that people are increasingly at home, not at work, or using different phone numbers. That's even more important now than it's ever been. And then there's also the risk side. So we were talking before about TCPA compliance. Neustar is one of the leading providers of intelligence to power TCPA mitigation strategies for a majority of the industries in the United States today. Making sure that companies are calling the right phone number with the right technology, the right number of times, and so forth is critically important. And then also ensuring that through this outreach that they're not actually contacting a phone that's been compromised. So we also have interesting risk intelligence that we could apply to ensure that this outreach that's designed to communicate with the customer for whether it's collections or just proactive messaging or marketing or support, that it's not actually going to a fraudster who could then compromise that information and take over an account. So these are just a sampling of the different ways that Neustar works with our clients to help them optimize their outbound dialing. And the end result is improved contact rates, reduced dials, increases in the number of contacts they make on the first dial, and then ultimately appropriate risk mitigation throughout the process. So in summary, outbound dialing has been getting much, much more difficult over the years, and the past 2 months has really made it even more so. Accurate data, unique insights, all help to make sure that we're contacting the right person on the right number at the right time. Art, do you have any final thoughts on this?
You know, at the end of the day, Neustar has really deep roots in this space as far as this complex area that consumers really don't have an appreciation for. How do we make calls across the globe? How do numbers really work? Gee, can I port my number? Because there was a period of time when if I moved from one carrier to another, it was like, well, I got to get a new phone number. And there's an incredible whole infrastructure and set of applications behind all of that. So, you know, it's that being tied in that level has certainly enabled Neustar to be able to do these applications and provide these kinds of services going forward. The other thing I want to close with is that I just really have to pay a compliment to anyone listening to this call and this webinar about the fact that there's a lot of heroics going on out there. I don't think anyone grows up thinking that they want to go into the customer service call center business. We all kind of found our way here. And one thing that I see extremely consistent is that people have customer service in their DNA. It's what I call that helping gene. And it's the outbound calling, as I said earlier, for contact tracing. It's that relationship between a brand and their customers that's embodied in that conversation is really important. And so much has gone on right now as far as organizations keeping those operations in place, running and humming. So it's just me paying a compliment to everyone. And then the way I'm wrapping up all my calls with everyone these days is I simply wrap up by saying, please stay safe.
I think that's a great sentiment. Thank you, Art. Thank you for all of you for joining today, and a special thanks to Art Scholler and Adam Russell for your time and your insight. If, as a listener, if you have further questions or want to discuss any of these issues further, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to take your questions and respond in a timely manner. Thanks for everyone for their time today. Please stay smart and stay safe.